stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Manfromleng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am beginning my review of the player cards in the Unspeakable Oath, the second Mythos pack in the Path to Carcosa Cycle. I've split up the review this time into the different classes, into 5 parts to make it a little easier for viewers to digest. So make sure you check out the reviews for the cards in the other classes. This is going to be the review for the Guardian cards, and there are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, maybe consider subscribing. So with that in mind, let's see what the designers have to offer Arkham Horror's Guardians in this Mythos pack. The first card in the pack is a Guardian asset. This is Trench Knife. It's a 1-cost asset with a combat skill icon and the item, weapon, and melee traits. It takes up a hand slot, and it has the game text, "Engage actions you perform do not provoke attacks of opportunity." Action, fight. You get +X combat for this attack. X is the number of enemies engaged with you. Trench Knife is, well, it's basically a twist on the knife from the core set, adding an engagement clause and swapping the damage bonus for a combat skill bonus that scales with the number of enemies engaged with you. Knife has always been one of those weapons of a last resort, and I'm afraid that Trench Knife really isn't that much better. First, Trench Knife's engagement clause is largely irrelevant in solo play since most of the enemies are going to engage you automatically anyway. The only situation I can think of where a Trench Knife might be useful is if you need to engage an aloof enemy while you're engaged with something else. That situation could crop up from time to time during the Dunwich Legacy cycle due to those bloody whippoorwills. It might also crop up during the Path to Carcosa cycle, since the man in the pallid mask is also aloof. That said, I really don't think it's worth playing Trench Knife, just in case you run into one of those situations. The combat bonus provided by the Trench Knife is obviously better than the knife if you're engaged with more than one enemy, but I can't think of many situations where I've been engaged with more than 2 enemies, so that scaling bonus isn't going to come into play all that often. Besides, most of the Guardians have such a high combat skill to begin with that most of that bonus is going to end up going to waste anyway, especially if you're playing on standard difficulty where you really only need to be 2 up before you pull from the Chaos bag. Frankly, I really don't see the point of playing Trench Knife in multiplayer either. Zoe could certainly use it to engage a bunch of enemies and gain a bunch of resources, or you could play it in conjunction with Taunt to try to rack up an impressive skill bonus. However, an engage action is still an action, and at some point you'll need to stop taking actions to engage enemies and start taking actions to kill them, because you will get overrun unless you're running a dedicated tanking build that can absorb all that punishment from all the enemies you've engaged. So here's hoping all those enemies that you've engaged don't have more than 1 health, because the Trench Knife isn't going to be much help taking them down quickly. Trench Knife seems pretty unimpressive. However, I do have a theory why we're seeing a card like this right now. Trench Knife is the first of 2 cards in the pack, the other being the Mystic card, Storm of Spirits, that you might consider including in your deck if you're worried about getting swarmed by enemies. Investigators don't really have many ways to counter a swarm of enemies right now besides Dynamite Blast, and that card is quite expensive at 5 resources. Now, when I talk about a swarm, I'm not talking about a couple of enemies popping up at a location. I'm talking about the gates of hell opening and enemies just pouring out of the encounter deck faster than you can dispatch them. We really haven't run into that type of scenario yet that has featured a swarm mechanic, and no, Swarm of Rats does not count. But the fact that the designers have created a card like Trench Knife suggests it's really only a matter of time before we see that mechanic come into play. Now, I don't really know what a swarm will look like in Arkham Horror, but I'm really not looking forward to finding out. I've run into the swarm mechanic a few times in Fantasy Flight Games, other cooperative card game, the Lord of the Rings LCG, and things can get out of hand really quickly unless you're prepared to deal with the swarm. Based on the stats on the trench knife, I'd be willing to bet the Arkham version of a swarm will throw enough enemies at you to seriously tax the ammo in a 32 Colt or 45 automatic, and it will blank the machete. The enemies could have relatively high fight values, or buff their fight values in some way. Hence the need for the combat skill bonus on the trench knife. Presumably the enemies will have relatively low health values, so the trench knife's lack of a damage modifier won't come back to bite you in the ass. If the enemies in the swarm have more than 1 health, you could be in deep, deep trouble. I could see myself playing trench knife to counter this type of scenario. It's cheaper than any of the guns, and it's not going to run out of ammunition. If the encounter deck is flooding the board with enemies, you're going to need a way to pull them off the more vulnerable investigators without provoking attacks of opportunity. And the skill bonus would certainly come in handy if the enemy's fight values somehow scale with their numbers. But this is just a theory I've got. I don't have any inside information on what the designers have planned, so we'll just have to wait and see what the future holds. The flavor text on Trench Knife suggests that it's seen more violence than most people see in a lifetime, and I really have my doubts about that, because I don't think many players are going to be putting Trench Knife in their deck in the foreseeable future. I think it's really a specific tool for a specific type of scenario, and if swarms of low health enemies become a thing, then it might be worth taking a second look at the trench knife down the road. But really, it's just a knife, and we've already got knife, and I'm not sure we really needed another one. The second Guardian card in the pack is Ambush. It's a 2-cost event that costs 1 experience point. It has intellect and combat skill icons and the tactic trait. It has the game text attached to your location. If there are no investigators at attached location, discard Ambush. Forced after an enemy spawns at attached location, deal 2 damage to that enemy and discard Ambush. Events that attach themselves to locations to produce effects have been around since the core set, and most of them have been pretty underwhelming, if just not downright bad. Personally, I've never had any success getting Barricade to work. I'll put it in a deck, play a couple test games, and then I just take it out in favor of something better, because it just never pulls its weight. Lure, Survivor card from the Essex County Express Mythos pack, is considered by many players to be among the worst cards released during the Dunwich Legacy cycle. It's very difficult to come up with situations when that card is useful, so it's really difficult to justify dedicating a slot to it. Hiding Spot, which was released in the Path to Carcosa Deluxe expansion, I think is easily the best of the bunch. It's cheap, it's fast, and it's a versatile way to set up a relatively safe haven at any location in play. It also has those 2 agility icons, which make it ideal for a deck that's looking to evade enemies rather than fight them. Ambush, it's certainly not as bad as Barricade or Lure. The ability to cause 2 damage to an enemy without having to make a skill test is quite significant, especially if you're deciding to play on hard or expert difficulty. However, Ambush forces you to jump through a fair number of hoops to inflict that damage, and I really can't see myself playing it in my solo Guardian decks because of it costs experience in a class that really has other priorities, namely shoring up its low sanity. I mean, maybe you pick it up later in a campaign when you've got a few experience points lying around, but it's really not going to be one of my first choices. The other thing with Ambush is that it costs an action to play, and there's really no way to guarantee that that forced effect is going to trigger unless you're playing an investigator like Zoe Samras, who has some combination of scrying from the core set and or Alyssa Graham from the Undimensioned and Unseen Mythos pack. That's a pretty janky deck with a lot of moving parts just to do 2 damage. Roland Banks could certainly try luring an enemy into the ambush using Dr. William T. Mallison from the Lost in Time and Space Mythos pack, but again, he'd need to drop a clue to redraw the encounter card, and there's still no guarantee that he's going to pull an enemy, so that strategy doesn't seem very good either. I guess you could always just set the ambush and hope for the best, but I found that movement and positioning are just so important in this game that I'm rarely staying at a location for long, and I'm certainly not going to waste the tempo just to sit at a location and hope that I get to trigger the ambush at some point. I think ambush is slightly better in multiplayer as long as the investigators are willing to stick together in a group. If there are 3 or 4 investigators camping a location, you're going to see 3 or 4 cards off the encounter deck during the Mythos phase, which means you've got a lot better chance of triggering the ambush's forced effect if you decide to play it blindly. If the investigators need to spread out, you could play Let Me Handle This, an event from the Path to Carcosa Deluxe expansion, to lure any enemy that spawns during the Mythos phase into your ambush. I think Let Me Handle This is great because you have slightly more control over which enemy gets ambushed if you're just pulling cards off the top of the encounter deck. Of course, you could end up with a Rats triggering the ambush rather than, say, the Agent of the King, which would be a much more juicy target. Of course, one of your fellow investigators could play Scrying or Alyssa Graham to stack the encounter deck in your favor to all but ensure an enemy gets caught in the ambush when you start drawing encounter cards. Ambush feels like one of those janky cards that, players are going to experiment with it for a little while, but they're ultimately just going to end up pulling it from their decks because it requires just too much time and energy to set up for too little payoff. I think this card would be a lot more attractive if it was fast and it didn't cost experience points, but as it stands, I just don't see many players upgrading to this card when there are so many better options. If you're planning to pack this in your multiplayer deck, you'll probably want to coordinate with the other players in order to boost the odds of your ambush hitting a decent enemy. That's going to do it for my review of the Guardian cards in the Unspeakable Oath Mythos pack. Unfortunately, there isn't really much here for Guardians to get too excited about. Trench Knife isn't going to see much play unless swarms of low-health enemies become a thing. We've already got Knife in the game, and this just seems sort of like a throwaway. I think swarms will happen at some point, possibly even later this cycle. But until then, I think Trench Knife is really going to struggle to find a home in Guardian decks. I've heard of a couple players who have experimented with trying to use it in Zoe Samras, and from all reports, it hasn't worked out too well. Ambush doesn't exactly scream auto-include either for Guardians. Guardians really don't have an easy way to manipulate the encounter deck at the moment, so I think more often than not you're going to be just throwing down the ambush and hoping for the best, which really isn't it's not a great strategy to work on. I might get around to testing ambush further in multiplayer. However, I really just don't see myself spending experience on this card at the expense of other more powerful cards that the Guardians have access to. That's going to do it for this review. If you enjoyed this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave me a thumbs up. It helps out the channel a great deal. If you agree or disagree with this review, you can always leave a comment down below. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to be notified of when I release future content. If you'd like to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.